All right, I think we can go ahead and get started for the sake of time. So welcome everybody. I'm really pleased that so many people are interested and able to join. Start by introducing myself, Wayne Siegel. I'm the chair of APPIC's postdoctoral committee. And today we are here to have a discussion around postdoctoral selection. And we're also going to be talking about issues around COVID as well also. So first I want to kind of just acknowledge, I'm not going to read everybody's name, but members of the postdoctoral committee. This is the hardest working group that I've ever been involved in, and I've had a fair amount of committee and leadership experience. Most everybody is on the call today, and so we're all going to be taking different parts. So just so you know who you're speaking with. And then overall, kind of, what do we want to accomplish today? So the issues, and this is really a discussion, and we want to hear what people have to say. We're not going to be providing any clear answers or solutions, but we want to kind of engage the community around some of these issues. So those involve the importance of postdoctoral training communities. So is that important? What's working with postdoctoral selection and what's not working? What are the complicating factors or barriers? And also, like, what can we do about that? Keeping a focus on those we train and their needs. Not that the needs of our programs aren't important, but focusing on the trainees, the postdocs themselves. And then issues around postdoctoral training and selection during a global pandemic. And we're figuring out as we go. So the structure of today's meeting is, there's some just very brief overview data that we thought would be useful to kind of show. So I'm going to go through a handful of slides, but that will be a small part of our time today. And then we have kind of some broad topics that align with those overall goals or aims that we talked about earlier. And we're going to kind of just throw those out there. And we would like you, participants, to respond through the chat or raising your hand, and we'll kind of see how that goes. This is an experiment. We've not really done this before, and it could work fabulously, but there are likely to be some bugs and hitches along the way, so please be patient with the process. And then this is a fairly passionate topic for many of us, and just a reminder for us all to be collegial. And we all think about our kind of common goals or interests. And I've already started, but so you're aware, the meeting will be recorded. There are several people who couldn't make the time and were interested in kind of what was discussed. And so the link to that recording will be posted on the APPIC Postdoc webpage within 2 to 3 days max, most likely tomorrow at some time. So starting with some of the data, and as I went through data, this is from the applicant survey of 2019. We did do a survey in 2020, but about 2 weeks into that survey, COVID broke loose and interrupted the data collection. People had significantly higher priorities in responding to a survey. So that data was pretty useless. And so this is from the year prior. And so just of applicants, and we had over 1,200 respond, who is applying to a postdoc and who wasn't. And this is fairly consistent, although the number of not applying seems to be growing a little bit every year. And so there's more of a trend that not everybody is doing a postdoc. And then also from the applicant survey. So why are people doing, or why are people wanting postdocs? And so that can be really useful in understanding. For licensure, for employment, advanced competencies, professional development, pursuing APPIC. I'm not going to read through everything. But that hour for licensure is really the biggest component of that. And we would think people would be doing it maybe all for advanced and specialized training, which is, technically APAs and the profession's working definition of what postdoctoral training should be, but reality says that hours for licensure does take on a significant importance. So then why do people not apply to postdoctoral programs? People want a job, salaries, economics. They don't want to relocate. They don't think that they need the postdoc for their professional goals. They want a job. More and more states are not requiring licensure. There may not be great opportunities around where people live. Maybe not done with dissertation, and they're not able to kind of move on to that. And then we can look at those smaller ones later. One of the things that's really important to understand that I neglected to mention earlier is an understanding selection. Although we don't know the total number or the total universe of postdoctoral programs, we have a sense, and there's over 1,200 listings in the UPPD, and we know there are more programs than that there is a surplus of programs to applicants, and every year more and more programs go with positions unfilled. And I think it's important for programs to kind of understand that that is kind of a growing trend as we think about why we may not be filling our positions, or our positions are harder they're harder to fill. So program preference, what are applicants really looking for in postdoctoral programs? And probably no surprise, they're looking for specific clinical training opportunities. Quality of program is a big factor. Not having to move is a big factor, and it seems to be relatively equal to those others, which I might think is not ideal from a trainer's perspective, but that's a reality of what we're living with. And applicants have moved for internship, and they're probably not wanting to move again. Work-life balance, pay, prospective employment. And again, these were rated on a scale of 1 to 7 in terms of how important these factors are. And then getting into the guidelines. And so I think most of the audience is probably aware APPIC, we put out suggested selection guidelines every year. And this is the breakdown of setting in terms of programs that are agreeing to follow those guidelines. And it's no surprise that the VA leads that, because VA requires all of their programs to adhere to the guidelines. So they would be happy that they're getting 100% compliance as indicated in the UPPD. And then some of these are really small numbers. And so if they're indicating very high compliance or very low compliance, it's hard to know what to make of that, because for example, residential school and military are low. But then as we look at kind of these larger categories, which are the programs that have kind of lower adherence to that? And again, it's not to call out these particular types of programs, but understanding what it is, what are those barriers that may be interfering, what could we do to maybe get more compliance that we believe would likely be in the benefit of the community, of programs and applicants. And then also looking at research time, and this isn't so equivocal, but programs that are offering more research time tend to be less willing or less following the guidelines. And then we also break this down by, of course, the neuropsych programs, whether they are absent or independent programs, or predominantly research programs are not required to follow the guidelines too. So it's just kind of trying to understand the landscape of who is doing what as maybe as fuel for information for our discussion. And then virtual interviews. This is a new field in the UPPD that we added in June of this year around COVID. And so I think it's interesting and good to be aware. What are programs indicating now in terms of what type of virtual interview or what their preference is? And so one category is virtual only. They're not offering any in-person interviews, and that's by far the vast majority of programs. And then many programs, next highest category is they're making them available, so that I think they anticipate doing a hybrid. And then nearly 100, it's strongly preferred, and 11 are saying they're not offering virtual interviews. And then we have missing data on seven programs. I expect this will likely shift as we move further into winter and as the infection numbers increase. And then also, and I don't want to make too much of this slide, and as I looked at it, is looking at what type of interviews are being offered by who's following the guidelines. And if you look at the far right column over here, it suggests that programs following the guidelines are more likely to, the red number in red is the last two categories, so strongly preferred or virtual. And so there's a slightly higher percentage of programs following the guidelines that are offering virtual only or strongly preferred. And it may be an applicant. I'm offering interpretation that could be an applicant preferred style. And then also we can look at the other categories of neuropsych and then research in terms of whether they're offering virtual only, strongly preferred interviews. So what have we learned so far overall? Is our interpretation of all of the data we have so far is people are generally satisfied. And I know we hear those instances when applicants are not satisfied or programs are unhappy that they've not filled their positions or have had trouble doing that. But what we know from the surveys is people are generally satisfied. And this is a really consistent statistic we've gotten from the last 3 years of surveys, is applicants around 85, 86%, they're getting their first or second ranked program. And so something's working for them. It may be a challenging process for them, but the outcomes are working pretty well. And then we know that applicants are applying to a range of programs that offer from no research to significant research. And we used to think those were very distinct categories and that we could actually have separate selection processes. But we know applicants apply to that range. And so those programs are competing for each other. And so with so many programs offering a range of research experiences, we need to consider all those programs in any solution or process that we develop and consider how to make that work. How can we get, and some research programs are choosing not to follow the program, the guidelines, how can we get them kind of more on board? One of the things that we have realized, the postdoc committee over the years, is the guidelines are complicated and there's a lot of information up there. And if you look at the APPIC postdoc website, there's a ton of information. Is how can we be clearer in our communication? There's a lot of turnover in postdoctoral training directors. And so new people are coming into these jobs and having to learn about what to do. And all the internship match is complicated. And that is a demanding job as a training director. It's maybe more challenging as a postdoc training director to learn what's going on. So how can we do a better job educating and communicating about that? And then this is from, again, 2019, but it was an interesting fact that internship training directors, now not all, but 47% are useful or very useful in educating and mentoring their interns around postdoctoral selection. I would hope that would be higher. And so what can we do? And the postdoc committee this year put out some resources to try and help that. We don't know yet what the impact of that is, but it's an area that we can do a better job with. Yeah, and this is just summary of the selection guidelines overall, across programs. And then to let people know, this is an interesting, people will sometimes pose the question, like, is the UPPD working? Do people go there? Well, the UPPD must be working. And so I pulled down the data. In fact, I had to get some modification because it was so big, we couldn't pull down the data. Since September 1, there's been 38,000 searches done. And I was able to exclude any program directors that search for their own program, which many of us do, to see kind of how that information comes up. So we can exclude all of that. And this is up 8,000 searches from last year at this time. And that's pretty significant. Not sure why that is. Is it an anomaly? Is it something to do with the pandemic? But I think that we can rest assured that if our listings are in the UPPD, it's accessible. People are looking in that for a resource, which was really the intent of what when we put the UPPD together. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Beth with our first topic area. And I want to remind people that you can respond through raising your hand or through responding in the chat and ask questions, and we'll and just turn your audio on and maybe your video as well too, so we can see you while you're asking a question. So with that, I'll give it to Beth.
Okay, so I think that the idea behind the rest of this roundtable is that, we have a few slides. Each of them has a broad topic on it, like this. One of us on the postdoc committee is going to just make a few comments about the broad themes that are represented on that slide. And but we really want to hear, questions, comments, feedback that you have in these topic areas. So that's sort of the broad, that's the format moving along from this point forward. So so in terms of this is basically the broadest question that we could be asking. Do we need any organization for postdoc programs? Do we need these guidelines? And this is something that we've talked about as a field for many years. And 10 years ago, we really did not have guidelines around postdoctoral selection or recommendations about that. And we all did things our own way, along our own timelines. And within our own spaces, I think that tended to work well for people. And so, and a lot of us remember those times and feel like that was, there were some advantages to that, certainly. We could tailor the timeline to what our program's needs were. I think on the balance sheet, I do think about the perspective of the trainees. And that's one element here that I think is makes a difference for them. As an internship training director also, I definitely have heard many students who are in a bind, due to having the timelines of offers be, and deadlines around when they need to respond be very different between different programs, so that they're being asked to make decisions before they've even interviewed at different places. I think that that's stressful. I do think that some have made the argument, and I am guilty of having made this argument or have made this argument in the past too, that, there's some advantages to having it be just more like a job market. This is kind of preparation for the real world. This is having to navigate that, is really mirrors what's going to happen from this point forward for them. And there is some merit, I think, to that perspective too. But the other point to that, the other perspective on that, I think, is that, it is a little bit self-serving for us to think about it from that perspective. It is true that, postdoc applicants don't have as much power as job applicants in negotiating, in determining, how things play out for them. So they really do have a limited ability to that. And so I think that, I think there are pros and cons to having organization and guidelines, and there are pros and cons to having it be more of a free market as it used to be. There's some advantages too. So. I think, I know as I was, oh, someone raised their hand. Elizabeth.
Hi, my name is Liz.
Yeah, hi.
Liz Kryzak. I am a track director at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus for one of our tracks that works with autism assessment or assessment in developmental disabilities. And so I wanted just to share, so I love the idea of having the universal guidelines for postdoc. When they first came out, I really loved this idea because I felt like it was going to cause a lot less stress for our interns as they were applying for postdoc and thinking through things. I've struggled though, because I've had some difficulties the last 2 years with following the guidelines and then having other sites in my area not follow the guidelines. And so last year in particular, I had a string of postdoc applicants who basically chose other places because they got offers first, and I couldn't like give them an offer right away. And it's hard because I think in our area in particular, there's a couple of big sites that have chosen not to follow the guidelines. And then from my own interns, I also learned that there were several sites that said they were following the guidelines and then gave them offers either the day of the interview or immediately after that they didn't, it wasn't like they were looking for a reciprocal offer. So clearly they decided not to follow the guidelines, even though on their websites they had clearly said they were, and during the initial part of the interview said that they were. And so I've struggled because I really, really want to support this process, but it's been harder, as I said, losing a couple of good applicants and following through with that. And then I also just wanted to say that I've really struggled with not being able to give my own internal applicants offers early. So 2 of my applicants last year mentioned that they would have stayed had they not had to go to other places to look, because each of them got an offer in an area that their spouse wanted to go to more. They really wanted to stay with us for training, but decided that not to because they felt like they owed it to their spouse to move to the area where they wanted to move. And so I was like, well, at least you got the opportunity to look. And both of them told me they wish they hadn't, which was hard to hear. So
I feel like, Liz, and I see a lot of people in the chat kind of concurring with your experience. And I really feel like you put your finger on something which is the most challenging, one of the most challenging elements of this. And that is that it works if we're all in. If some people are not, or people start to drift, then it does not benefit the people who are following the guidelines and being part of the community. I think that is exactly the dilemma that we face in this structure. I don't know if other members of the roundtable want to comment on that, but I think that is really it, what you just said.
I would just add that I think local forces are extremely powerful in this process. And this is certainly kind of a broad mission, but when there are pockets of either content area, a particular type of program that's not following the guidelines or saying they are, but then not, or geographical area that is not, I think it can be really challenging to aim for the bigger mission when your local forces kind of are prescribing a different approach.
just to follow up, I'm wondering, are there any strategies that you've been putting together to try to increase that? Because I think my concern is that I feel like there's fewer and fewer sites in my area over time that are deciding to follow this. So I'm concerned being one of the only places left doing it at some point is going to be untenable for me.
Yeah, I don't, this is Wayne, I don't have a magic solution to that. Not specific to your issue, but I think overall is I think there are programs, or I know there are programs that believe if I don't fill my positions and they're going elsewhere or they're going early, that program is not following the guidelines. And I think that there's misperceptions out in the community that sometimes people may get an early offer that could be from a research program or a program that's choosing not to follow the guidelines. And then another program such as mine is making an early offer in response to that reciprocal offer, which I'm allowed to do, or you're allowed to do. And then so people have this perception that we're not following the guidelines and that the system is not working because of that. There's also a perception by programs where if I'm not filling my positions because I used to fill them all with top people, then something's not working correctly. And again, we have this kind of there's more applicants than positions, and so that's really going to happen. The other factor that plays into this is the reciprocal offer that, and this is something that I think programs can do, is when you're interviewing people, is let them know that if you do get a reciprocal offer is to let us know. Now, if my interviews aren't done until like the first week of February and somebody's making offers in January, that probably doesn't do a whole lot of good. But if we look in the UPPD, we know that people that are going early are making them mid-February or right before the uniform notification date. And so if we have our interviews done and an applicant really wants to come to my program, that they're going to contact me with a reciprocal offer. And then, I know I'm saying probably too much, is if there's like a pocket of program where people are having problems, call me, call APPIC, call anyone on the committee, and we'll see what we can do. And if it requires like a conference call to try and get people together, we're happy to try and work to make that happen and to appeal to people's maybe reasonable side to try and get cooperation.
Sorry, go ahead, Amy, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Wayne, I'm glad you talked a bit about the reciprocal offer, because there is a question in the chat box about whether the reciprocal offer approach does address the issues that Liz was bringing up. Like, shouldn't that magically solve the problem? And I guess I would say that for many cases it does, but certainly it does require timing to be in line. The program needs to be ready to make a reciprocal offer, and that also the reciprocal offer can only go to the top candidate. So I would say that it does address some issues, as Wayne was just discussing, but Liz, it still doesn't meet all of those issues. And Jamie, feel free to speak up if you still have other questions about that piece. Or James, sorry.
No, that pretty much answered it. I'm coming from a forensic site, so it's a little bit different because there's sort of there's like the UND, and then they have sort of their own deadline, and we're always sort of balancing those things. And that's why I sort of think the reciprocal offer is so beneficial. But I think you're right that there are some holes, and it does. Doug's point about needing to be ready to make the reciprocal offer, I think is really well taken. You can't really make one unless you already know. So it does seem like it helps some issues, but maybe isn't a complete fix.
So I'm just going to continue. One of my responsibilities today is just kind of keeping us on track with the chat box question. So I wonder if Wayne, you could talk, or somebody on the committee could talk just a little bit about the kind of after the UND is passed, the way people can use the UPPD to figure out which positions are still open. So there's some questions about that in the chat.
Yeah, so we put out a lot of information at points, and as the UND approaches, and it's confusing. So we try and communicate and this year it's the 24th of February. If on the 25th, you have not filled your positions, you can go into your UPPD listing and indicate that you have an unfilled position. It's a new field, okay? Do not put anything in that field until the 25th of February. And then applicants can search the UPPD for unfilled positions. So maybe not, I don't like the word, it's not unlike the old APPIC internship clearinghouse, but it's a way for programs to let it be known that they have a position available, and for applicants to look for programs, and they can still use all the other search fields in the UPPD that exist in terms of location, type of program, specialty, focus or emphasis area. And it's a way to kind of match people up. And then the selection guidelines, it's not a free-for-all, I don't like that word, but people can fill positions as they want. As soon as they get a qualified applicant, they can make that offer if they want. They can go through any selection process that they want. Just good ethics would govern that at that point. But people have to kind of update their listings in order to get the word out there. And then one more point of clarification about that is on the day before the UND, we clear out that data field on unfilled positions. So if you enter it in early, it's going to get cleared out. You have to re-enter it. because lots of people do that, and then it just looks like there's this abundance of positions available that there aren't. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. I wanted to just reflect back. There's a number of people who hold multiple roles. They're serving as both internship and postdoc training directors. And so the timeline and the crunch of doing this quickly is really challenging when you're doing 2 recruitment seasons simultaneously. And I'm not a training director of both, but I empathize with that 100%. And I also wanted to invite, if you're comfortable, Chelsea, to just talk a little bit about what you had typed in the chat box. I think you had a number of different points that I think apply to a number of people and might be helpful just to get some reflection on that. It's Chelsea McIntosh. Oh, you have
Sorry,
a baby.
sorry, I heard you the whole time. I just had to get my son. So what I wrote in the chat was just that we actually have a really large organization, so we have the opportunity to take a lot of postdocs. So we can take up to 6 to 8 each year, which is like a great opportunity for people looking for a residency. And we're in kind of a weird position though, because we work in community health centers where there's not a lot of psychologists who work in community health. So the pool is smaller. But what we found in terms of our application experience, because we had always wanted to follow the guidelines and we are rule followers to the letter. So we had been following, but what had happened was we would have people say, I'm nervous that I'm not going to get another offer. So I've already accepted this offer even before we were interviewing. So then we said, should we move up our interviews? So we tried that. And we found, again, I think someone wrote in the chat that without the UND, people offer earlier and earlier. So we said, you know what? We're going to try not following and see what happens. So last year was the first year we didn't follow. But what we did is we followed every guideline except for giving an offer ahead of time. So within that, people did ask, which makes us know that we're not the first choice for people necessarily, for some of our applicants, if they could wait to UND, and we did. So we allowed them to wait until the UND to see what all their offers were so that they had that choice. But at the same time, it felt like it didn't undercut if they interviewed with someone else afterwards, or if before, never mind. I guess my point is that we wanted it to keep it open so we're not pressuring applicants, because that's the intention of the postdoc guidelines. But then at the same time that we felt like we could offer as we went along, because we would put all this effort into making these interview days, and then half the applicants would drop out even before the interview day. So we found that went fairly well last year, but we also noticed in the last couple of years, we get applicants very, very late. And they're some of our strongest applicants. And they have certain life situations sometimes, or they weren't sure if they were going to finish their dissertation on time, things like that. And we've gotten feedback that the whole system of doing the match is kind of overwhelming for some applicants, because they've been applying every year, practicum, internship, and now there's this other hoop to jump through in postdoc, where it was kind of nice where they got to a position where they could apply, May, June. So we're at a point now where we say we respect that the UND exists. If you want to wait till UND, you absolutely can. But we're going to have rolling interviews as people come in, and we're flexible with that to try to follow, but then also go with the trends of what we are seeing. So I don't know if that answered what you wanted me to clarify, or if there's anything else you wanted me to add. Okay.
Wayne, did you have any comments or response?
I was wondering if others in the committee had a response. It's confusing to me because I'm not sure that I understand if kind of a rolling or a uniform acceptance date, which is maybe not that different than what you're describing, and people have thought that that would work. I don't know that there's a whole lot to gain by doing this. If programs cooperated, this would work with a uniform notification date. And then I'm also struck, and I'm reading through the chat about people saying it's not working, they're losing applicants, but the vast majority of applicants are getting their 1 or 2, so they're going where they want to go. So are we really losing them, or are they just choosing to go elsewhere? And the stories I hear, and I get lots of phone calls around the uniform notification date from applicants, sometimes in tears, is when they've been pressured to do something and they feel like they're going to get nothing, and you know they don't have a lot of experience handling that pressure. They don't feel like they have a lot of power in those situations, and so those are the situations that I guess concern me the most. So I don't know that that's a direct answer.
I also, Wayne, you mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth driving home again. I certainly have found that over time, my program is not getting its, consistently getting, exactly what we want. And I think about how many more postdoc positions there are this year versus 3 years ago, 5 years ago. That the market is such that there's just way more positions than there are postdocs. And if you looked at the data that you presented earlier about geography being so important, when you wanted a strong PEDS postdoc 5 or 10 years ago, maybe there were 5 great places and you had to uproot and move to those places. And maybe now there's many more opportunities where you're doing your internship training or your graduate school training. And those opportunities, I think, to stay locally or within a smaller geographical area impact programs elsewhere. So I think that I certainly see less movement, or I can predict, that person's going to stay there, that person's going to stay there, because they don't need to come to my site any longer. So I just think that's an important frame of mind to keep.
So suggested that, and I don't know that we have any clear answers to all of those issues that were put out there, but maybe shifting to the next topic, which I think is strongly related. So with that, maybe Aaron can kind of take on.
Yes, thanks, Wayne. Yeah, so I believe we've already been hitting on many facets related to this topic, but we are interested in having a conversation about what the full scope of barriers may be, especially if you're a program that believes having an organization around this process would be good. What are barriers that might prevent your program from participating in an organized process? And so obviously we have already hit on the idea of, am I going to get the applicants that I would have received if I hadn't followed an organized process is a barrier for some programs. Training directors who are both internship and postdoc training directors have to deal with often overlapping processes that can make it challenging to do interviews and get ready for reciprocal offers as quickly as one might hope. In addition, making sure that applicants really understand the process and that they follow the process, and how does our pipeline help inform applicants from even the doc program all the way up to the point where they're applying to a postdoc may be important to understand, and there may be certain barriers within the pipeline that exist in terms of educating our consumers. So I will stop there and just open it up for continued discussion about barriers that you have anticipated or experienced, or barriers that you believe may be there that would be helpful for us to know about.
So I'm just going to jump in with the first comment. People are saying that not following the guidelines contributes to some of the difficulties we are seeing. Is there barriers to making the guidelines required as part of APPIC membership?
So I might defer to Wayne or another member of our roundtable on this one, but I do believe that part of the challenge is capturing the full universe of postdocs is important in making this work. And as Wayne points out, only 30% of programs are currently APPIC members. And so it can be difficult to figure out how to capture the full universe of postdocs in a way that would allow making a requirement to participate actually beneficial. Is there anything else Wayne or others would add about that?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is, I mean, the committee has talked about trying to get programs to focus more on the applicant. And I think maybe programs that are going early, maybe thinking about why are they doing that? Why do they need to do that? And if programs were more applicant focused, things would work better. It wouldn't remove all the problems. We still have an issue someone had typed in earlier with research programs, particularly grant-funded programs on a rolling basis. I don't know that we're going to fix that, or we're going to get NIH to change how they fund grants and then those postdocs. That's a small percentage of the problem that we see, though. But we need something that would get the majority of programs to kind of want to work towards us. And I'm continually struck with the data I presented earlier that such a high percentage of applicants are getting what they want. That's pretty compelling. And of course, that's not every applicant, but I think we got, over 1,200 responses, which is pretty good response rate.
Yeah, someone pointed out that it really helps the applicant and maybe perhaps less so the program if you're thinking about it from kind of you're wanting your number one or your number two. And if you take a bigger picture perspective, taking a step back, you know, as educators, as trainers, as leaders, you know, wanting to foster the development of applicants, certainly having applicants who are engaged in kind of the educational effort of their choosing is in line with, I think, what we do as well. And I believe it's not, you know, I'll let someone who's an internship training director speak to this as well, but the formal match for internship leans toward preference for the intern. Is that correct? For the intern applicant?
Yeah, the computer match, the algorithm is designed in a way that if there is a situation where an applicant would benefit from a selection over the program, it does benefit the applicant, but it's a very small difference.
It's just very obvious on the postdoc level and less obvious on the internship level because everything happens behind the scenes in an algorithm.
Yeah. There was a comment in the chat earlier about the competing demands of being an internship director and a postdoctoral training director, and several of us on the committee have both of those roles, and that's a problem. We know that if we push the uniform notification date out further, that more people would go early. And so we can't do that yet, but the goal would be if we can get more cooperation among programs, that we could get some agreement to move the date much later. And that would be better for everybody, not just the training directors, but you know, interns, those of us that are internship directors, your interns start and then boom, they have to start applying to postdocs, and we're writing letters of recommendation and we don't really know them very well yet. And so the applicants would benefit, the programs would benefit. But if we pushed it, it would provide more opportunity for people to go early. So we need more cooperation before we can do that. I'd love to see it 6 weeks to 2 months later in the year. Because it's challenging. I'm coordinating both of my programs right now. And the overlap is really, it's hard to manage.
I'm curious about, what ideas people have.
There's a comment about how postdoc isn't a necessity for internship. It's part of an internship is required for the degree, and that the greater number of variability or options following internship could also be an additional consideration or barrier. I don't know, Aaron, if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah, certainly the field of options for people looking at the postdoc process is much wider than for internships. And so I live in a state, for example, in New Mexico, where postdoc hours are not required for licensure. And so that presents considerations for my postdoc program in terms of how we advertise ourselves and what we market ourselves to do. It also means that we sometimes are in competition with jobs that operate on a completely different timeline than we operate on. And I think pretty much what we've had to do is just radical acceptance about this, that we are trying to get focused on what we believe our postdoc can do well, and stay focused on that, and sort of recognize that we only capture a small part of the market, and that interns, our own interns or interns coming from other programs that may apply to us, may also be looking at other options.
So it sounds like we're all making an argument for that organization would be really good. And then, so like, how do we do that? And I want to pose it as not the postdoc committee's problem, although it's something that we struggle with a lot and talk about a lot. It's the field's problem. So how can we do better?
Wayne, this is Doug. Are you able to go back a few slides to the slide where you had a breakdown of who's following the guidelines based on setting? Yeah, there you go, that one right there. I just wanted to make the comment that I really feel like building a community around this issue is really important. We've kind of touched on that a little bit, but if you look at the sort of bottom half of this graph or so, or the bottom third, I suppose, where there's less agreement on following the guidelines. So I'm at a children's hospital, so I'll take that row for an example. If the community around postdoctoral programs at children's hospitals could come together as a smaller group and sort of talk about this issue and decide as a small community that you're going to either you follow the guidelines, for example, I think that's where we might get positive impact in terms of making progress on this issue. Because if most postdoctoral programs based out of children's hospitals decide to follow guidelines, then the difficulties that Liz commented on earlier would not be as big of a problem anymore, because if your competition is following the guidelines, then the stress is not going to be as significant.
So why don't we shift a little bit? We can always come back. So barriers. So Myron Hayes is going to talk about kind of, and this may factor into some of these other points that have been made.
So hopefully my camera is working and people can hear me. Oh, good. So one of the things that I would like to put out to the group is, what is a postdoctoral program? Is a postdoctoral program just a program that's APA or an APA accredited, or is it an APPIC member? Is a postdoctoral program any program that gives supervised hours towards licensure? Or kind of broadly, what is a program, and to provide a little bit of context in where we have been so far, as I've been taking notes, one of the things that's striking me is, do we need to have a match for programs, however we choose to define that, and let the other things go their own way? So people would make a decision. Do you want to join a program or not? Do you want to, and which is a very different way of thinking. But we'd like to hear what the group has to say and what your experience has been. And as Wayne said, this is not a quiet group. I know that people have opinions. We're all psychologists.
So to add, APA and APPIC define what an internship is for the most part, and mostly APA because the push is really predominance of programs now are accredited. But who defines what a postdoc program is? The specialties like neuro, health, rehab, and the specialties define it to some degree. But like, who's to say what a program is? And if you saw the other slide, the number of private practices that exist out there are very high. And some are probably great training experiences and some are maybe not so great. So what does that mean? And we know applicants are going to these experiences.
Let me pose the question slightly differently and see if the group has some feedback. If you tomorrow you waved your hand and you said, we're no longer a program, but we're going to keep taking people to get their postdoc hours, what would you stop doing? So if you could just stop doing stuff, what would you stop doing?
All right, I'll bite. I would say I wouldn't. I think that a program's pointless if it's just to get hours. If tomorrow you told me that I didn't have to teach people a specialty and that they were just going to get hours here, I'd get out of the business. Because in my mind, this is what a postdoc is about. It's a way to work in a very concentrated way with your specialty providers and specialists in that area to learn that skill. And so if you tell me you just want to get hours, I'm going back to Wayne's slide, hope for future employment were the top two. And it wasn't down till develop advanced competency was number 3. It was still 55%. In my mind, that's really where we need to kind of drive people that this is a place that you can do more than just get your hours, but you can really develop a unique skill.
So I'm trying to take a look at the questions here, the comments. So it sounds like there's really for those of you who have commented, there's a feeling that the postdoc needs to be conceived and talked about as building a skill set to a depth that makes you different from other people, perhaps even doing the same kind of work. Would that be a fair summary?
And an emphasis on training rather than free labor.
So maybe this is a supply and demand issue with the comment that I just put in there. We have one idea about what postdocs should be, but applicants, because they're voting with what their behavior. They're accepting some of these less stringent experiences that are maybe not training or as rigorous. And so where we keep offering a product that isn't as in high demand as it used to be. And now we're all upset and accusing everyone of cheating because our product isn't, I'm being a little snarky. And so maybe that's like, what do we do about that?
Hi, I'm Julie. I'm a training director of fellowship at Boston College. And I mean, I agree with everything people have said. And I think for us in Massachusetts, where like postdoc hours are no longer required hours for licensure, it feels like we're, have to kind of challenge even applicants to think of us as not just, because they don't technically need licensure hours in Massachusetts to postdoc hours. So it feels like a weird message sometimes to hold, like, I know our state doesn't require it. And yet, like, here's kind of why we think training outside of just hours is an important aspect of being a psychologist. So I think for those of us who are in states where legally it's not required or asked for or like valued in the same way, it feels really difficult.
So you're raising a really good question, and if you don't mind me continuing to ask a question to your response, what do you tell people about the states? And at this point, it's still the majority of states that require postdoctoral training hours. If they choose not to do their hours, do you just encourage them to pray that they never have to leave? I believe you said you were in Boston.
Well, I mean, sometimes I ask about our fellows coming in of like, what made you still come to Massachusetts, engage in a postdoc fellowship when it's not kind of required? And I think there are like multiple things we talk about. One, like it's not always clear for, postdocs coming whether they'll stay in Massachusetts. So nationally, who knows where life will take you. You might have to go to another state, and that state might require postdoc hours. So to feel kind of like equipped and well-informed about kind of, leaving all of your kind of options open professionally. I think, we often talk about that, like, do people really feel ready to independently practice after internship, regardless of hours, right? And I think most of our fellows, at least, and we're getting a kind of a skewed sample because they're with us, but I think most of them agree, like there's no way I would have felt comfortable going into private practice or working independently after internship, that this year is so valuable in helping them feel like just professionally more grounded and comfortable with what they're doing. It's also for us an intense clinical year. So if you're looking to work in a college counseling center or, or even other intensive clinical areas, that it's actually like a much needed experience, and that you will feel the difference, right? Like if at the end of fellowship, oftentimes we hear fellows say, I can't imagine not having had this year. Like it's such a growth promoting experience. And I think our training like system allows for that, or kind of fosters that, like that balance of you're still kind of a trainee and you get ample supervision, and we're really like challenging you and pushing you to be more independent thinkers. And they practice a lot that here, like part of our kind of agenda is like take some risk while you have supervision, and we could help you kind of navigate those things. So I think for them, it's hard to imagine like, how do you do this without having had this like very rich intensive year that feels very different from internship? And I suppose if you don't have that experience, you might not know what you don't know. But for those who have gone through it, they are clear advocates for, aside from licensure hour, this is really, really important year for me professionally.
Thanks, Julie.
I don't. And I think we skipped Amy's slide, which seems to be kind of natural question. We've addressed some of this, but maybe a little bit more focus. Oh, you're muted, Amy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think this slide can go anywhere, because where do we go from here? What do we do? How can we continue to foster community and address so many of the barriers that were raised today? And I want to highlight actually what you just typed into the chat box, Wayne. I was having the exact same thought and have this flash that we did something, the postdoc committee did something with this maybe a year or two ago. This idea that education about the purpose and function of postdoctoral training needs to start, or could possibly start earlier in the pipeline. And maybe it also means educating DCTs of internship programs and DCTs of graduate school programs. Some of the data you presented, Wayne, showed that interns want more from their internship DCTs about understanding and navigating the postdoc process. And so it feels to me like that does feel like a natural place, perhaps, to start. But I'm wondering what other ideas people might have about how we can continue to improve this system and kind of work together as a community.
I want to link back to an earlier point in the data that Wayne presented about how people found internship training directors, potentially less supportive or with less information than we would have anticipated them to have. And I am an internship training director, so I understand the stresses of that, but I think that seems to me to be a natural point of advocacy for us to provide more support to internship training directors so that they understand and can educate the postdoc or the potential applicants of the advantages or of the range of options available to them and what the advantages are of those.
Yeah, I get, to Beth's comment, I get lots of emails from now up until February from applicants like, how do I apply to postdocs? And so people aren't teaching them how to do that. In grad school, the DCT, and they usually have a coordinator that's responsible for helping to track people to do that for internship. But for postdoc, it probably falls to the internship director.
Wishing we had a live poll we could do to see how many people have dual roles on this call, or have networks where they could bring some of this information back to their internship training directors as well. But I can't do that quickly. Looks like Michael typed in maybe some radical acceptance regarding the changes in the postdoctoral training landscape and considering how many postdocs we offer versus demand.
Yeah.
Thoughts about that?
So maybe a different way of phrasing that question is, where do we think we're going to be in 5 years with postdocs? What's it going to look like? Or what should it look like given what we know about applicants, what they're doing, the profession?
I have a question that perhaps someone could answer. We often say more and more states are dropping the requirement for postdoc licensure. And the last time I looked was probably about a year and a half ago. And I think it was somewhere in the high teens. And I guess I just wonder, are we aware of what that number is? Are more and more states moving in that direction? Because I don't know where we fall with that. Because I think, as Julie brought up earlier, you know, geographical mobility is really important, particularly at this stage of life, for people who are just starting a career. I don't know, does anybody have that number or know that?
Let me just say, California has had a proposition to get rid of our postdoctoral requirement in front of our legislature, I think every year for the past probably 10 years, and it's really never gone anywhere. And we're the biggest state by far. So I think people's belief that this is going to happen right away and there'll be 49 states with 1 or 2 provinces and a couple of territories as being outliers is naive. But I also hear a lot of academic programs telling people that, oh, you don't need to worry about a postdoc because it's not going to be required. And that's not the reality. Brad, you're in tech. Are you in Texas or Tennessee? I'm sorry, Brad. Where are you? What state are you in?
I'm in Tennessee currently, but I grew up in West Texas, I'm proud to say.
I was just wondering whether Texas has had the same experience of, you know, people saying it's going to go away and it ain't going away.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Texas.
This is Laura Zambrano. I'm in Texas currently, and
Okay.
I haven't heard anything about trying to get rid of the postdoc requirements recently. But we are very loose in terms of like postdoctoral training and what that counts. And but it does make it a lot easier for people to get licensed if they have a formal postdoc, and if it is APA and if it is APPIC. Like we're actually going through the process with one of our postdocs of submitting documentation for licensure, and because we're not currently APA or APPIC members, then like we have to provide a whole lot of extra documentation. So I mean, I guess in that way it's helpful for people to have postdocs, at least so far.
So would it be fair to say it's in your enlightened self-interest to join APPIC to make your life easier?
That's actually one of my tasks for this week, to figure out how do I do that so that it's easier for all of our future postdocs. But I'm just like stepping into the training director role. So I figured this would be a good opportunity to try to find out more about this.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Liz over at American Lake in Tacoma, Washington. And I was wondering what a couple people just started talking about, which is I haven't heard a lot about getting board certified in APPIC and how much there's been such a push of everyone's going to be doing this and we need to do this. And then it feels like it doesn't quite catch up. So in terms of that being a selling point, I guess I'm wondering how people are factoring that in or not. And then what you just said, which is, do we have more info about how much postdoc experience is mattering to people who are hiring for jobs or jobs that have different salary ranges or types of opportunities? Like, is there more information there that maybe we don't have, or which types of postdocs are going unfilled or maybe in surplus? Like, do we have any breakdown of that? So that was kind of a mixed bag question, but I'm just wondering what people's thoughts are.
Those are great questions. There were probably 7 or 8 questions in there. One that I can answer pretty easily is we don't really know which postdoctoral programs are not being filled, or at least we don't know in a clear way because there's not a universe. We don't have a formal match. We can only get that information through surveys. The surveys that the committee has done in the years past, we get a lower response rate from programs. And it's hard because many programs have, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more different types of postdocs. So we don't necessarily know which ones aren't being filled. What I can say from survey data and talking to people is very highly specialized postdocs that are very unique, like not in a recognized specialty, that are maybe in like liver disease or something like that. there's just less demand for those type of postdoctoral positions, and so they're having trouble. And then we also have some data to suggest that some of these private practice programs that are not well established are having trouble filling positions as well also. And I kind of like that trend, but we don't know that in a clear way, because it suggests that people are wanting more of a program or an established program. You know, I'll also add a problem that I've noticed this year through the pandemic, that applicants that have had problems with programs reneging on offers or closing because of the pandemic, the majority of those have been non-established postdoctoral programs in non-institutions. So they had less stability, and the pandemic affected them more. And so there were more casualties through the selection process with those type of programs. And I don't know what that means in terms of a trend to move forward.
I think another part of your question is about board certification, Liz. And I think, you know, we represent, I think on the APPIC panel, I'm sure in the audience, people from who are ABAPT in different areas. I think it does depend on the area of specialization, but certainly having a postdoc, it can be either required for board certification or facilitates it, kind of just makes the candidate go through kind of that first step a little bit easier because they have a documented postdoc. They don't have to demonstrate that what they did for their experience is equivalent to a postdoc. So I think that is a selling point, as a few folks commented in the chat as well. I don't know if others have perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm in neuropsych, and in neuropsychology, you're sort of expected to be board certified. And if you graduated after 2005, you have to do a 2-year fellowship. So there's not even a question. You have to do it. So I think, which sort of lends itself to the comments that other people have made, is that what's the purpose of postdoc? And it's not just to get hours, it's to pursue a specialty or to learn a specific skill maybe. And maybe we need to advertise that more, as other people have talked about.
Yeah, so, and that's a good point, Doug. There are some of the ABAP specialties that require in their criteria that you've completed a postdoctoral experience in that specialty, so you couldn't get boarded. But it's like straight clinical psychology, that's not necessarily true. I wanted to just transition because I feared at the beginning no one was going to talk, and we were just going to have a lot of silence. So we've had some really good discussions, but I want to make sure that we can at least touch on some of the other topics. So training and selection and adaptions during COVID. Like, it's wide open. How's that going? What are people's big questions about this? And it can be from interviewing to how we're training. One of the things I have particular questions about, and I would say it's possible some of my interns and postdocs are on this, but I can say without confidence, I'm lucky I have a strong class. But if I needed to be doing like remediation during this time with telesupervision and a lot of remote practice, that would scare me. That would be challenging. And I've heard those challenges from others.
And it would be great if people could share anything that you've done that works incredibly well, or anything that you've done that you failed miserably at and you would like to have other people avoid. I believe in vicarious learning. I don't need to repeat a mistake. I can let other people make it for me.
Is it like going great for everybody? Like piece of cake? I know it's hard out there. I just put in the chat that I think APPIC put out a request for proposal yesterday around innovations for training. I don't think it said COVID specifically, but it was around teletraining and telesupervision.
This is Matt Cordova. I'm internship and postdoc training director at VA Northern California. And I think this is true for our internship and our postdoc. We've been fortunate to get laptops, GFE laptops for our trainees. And then between that and the different video platforms, that's allowed us to be in the room with our folks and also to have them record sessions and upload them to a media drive for review. All of our trainees are working from home and have been since we onboarded them. So that's been an essential part. A tricky part in our integrated care fellowship. So doing hybrid medical appointments like in the pain clinic with our pain physician and physical therapy colleagues, that's meant having me in my office, a postdoc at home and tapped in through Teams, and then our colleagues in the actual face-to-face encounter. So we've had to do, I think, some gymnastics to get to do joint visits and observation, but it's worked well so far. And I'll just answer Wayne's question about recording. We have been doing recording either with the little EDP mics that look like this, the little CAD mics that you can plug into a GFE laptop and then use Audacity, which I know a lot of the EBP programs are doing. So that's worked, and we got our IT folks to let us then save and map directly onto a media drive. So that's worked well. Some of our trainees are using WebEx and recording straight onto our M drive that way.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Others, should we shift topics if this one isn't as?
There are a couple of comments, Wayne, that I just was seeing. Developing cohesion in the class. I think developing community and cohesion has definitely been a challenge, as well as finding ways to support trainees. It sounds like someone's doing co-assessment and co-therapy to really kind of support and provide some direct observation as well. So I don't know if those are topics of interest to discuss, but it's hard to connect when you're never seeing people face to face or seeing them very infrequently. And Myron, I think you brought up like the incidental learning, like you run into a provider in the hallway and you can check in with them about something. Or I know cross-disciplinary experiences are harder if you were in primary care, like warm handoffs or in a neurology clinic. Those kind of incidental interactions that I think mean so much to trainees and maybe provide some very valuable training experiences I know are missing from my program as well. I don't know if others have thoughts.
Yeah, those are the intangibles are really hard. I've also noticed it's a social justice issue too, is that postdocs often don't have like maybe a separate office. They challenge like working from home, and maybe like I can afford the best broadband I can buy that can be got in the Twin Cities. But I think that the trainees often cannot afford that, and sometimes they have connectivity issues. Or if they have their significant other working from home as well, they've got competing demands through internet. So.
Hi, I'm at Richmond. I'm the rehab site training director, and I just agree with everyone. Once we were able to get the government laptops for the trainees, it was so much better. Although the connectivity issues, you're right, depend on where they are. But it really struck me as one of our postdocs had finished a rotation on our inpatient unit, And the first day the second postdoc started was the day they all got sent home for telework. And she was on the rotation for 6 months. And it was really noticeable how hard it was for her to build relationships with the team in the same way. And that is something that I really want to focus on, because we're a rehab postdoc, and that teamwork is just as important as what they're learning about the patient care, and something that we're really going to turn our focus to.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could certainly relate to that. And I think, you know, especially at a postdoc level where you're training folks, not only in kind of their clinical work or whatever area of specialty, but kind of how to be a colleague, staff member in a professional environment, not having the face-to-face, I think has been really, you know, detrimental. And back to what Maine said about social justice issues, we've also found that so, you know, part of the trainee experience for us is they have like a weekly multicultural conversation hour. And then they also join the larger kind of diversity, inclusion kind of conversation with staff. But I'm recognizing that like not having personal relationship with folks makes then like kind of conversation that could be somewhat challenging or difficult or just uncomfortable, even 10 times harder. So we're noticing that like among staff who know each other, we could say something, but we have a prior relationship. So there's a little bit more wiggle room around kind of checking in or knowing maybe what the intention of the person was. Whereas for new folks, that's much harder to read. So I think just even thinking about like, if any of you have like kind of diversity training piece, that has been, I think, somewhat more just difficult to navigate. And I would also personally be really interested to know if people have creative ideas of like, for the incoming applicants, how do you like convey, you know, the missing pieces, like the warmth that you might feel from a site, or like, I know for us, like I often check in with our admin assistants after like an interview day to say like, how was that interaction? People just kind of friendliness, and like the relational piece feels really important. So I know some sites like do videos or like maybe welcome introductions in a particular way. So I'm curious how other people are kind of navigating that.
Would it be useful, to Julie's comments, for like the committee to maybe collect just like what people are doing for their interviews, and we could just have a document storage somewhere where those are, and people would be willing to share them? How useful would that be? We can put something out on the Postdoc News mail group and say if that's something that would be useful. I'm hearing that would be great. That would be great. So I know that in 4 minutes, we can't really cover the neuropsych world. We didn't manage our time very well. But maybe Doug and Brad, if there's like something you want to kind of say about this, and maybe another roundtable, we would have more time to talk about those issues.
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, even though with, you know, neuropsych postdoc selection is different because we have a computer match, but in one way it's not that different because not everybody uses the match. So we face many of the same challenges that people have described before.
And I could just add that through apps, and this year the match day is prior to the UND, and one of the concerns in terms of APPIC and Epson is making sure that the systems don't kind of interfere with each other or cause undue problems. So there's an attempt to coordinate that from year to year, although the neuropsych match has been linked to the INS conference in the past. So the question this year, with Apson really strongly encouraging people to do virtual interviews, as APPIC has, is that going to change things in the future for the neuropsych match? So just a lot of moving parts and a lot of things going on.
Yeah. I would add to that, as an internship director with 2 neuropsych track interns, it's extremely distressing for them when they're applying to postdoc because they're always applying to a blending of apps and match and then independent programs. And it's just very hard to navigate, and it's not dissimilar from what the rest of the postdoc world experiences and the issues we talked about today. So with that, maybe we can wrap up. I want to thank everyone for their input and collegiality. I don't think we solved any issues, but it was really nice to hear people's input and to put some faces to names of people I've not met in person as well. We will be doing some type of post-meeting survey, and one of the questions we'll have is, would something like this, if we do it again, would that be really useful for people? So this was kind of an idea that we had. I feel like it's been a positive experience, but interested in other people's thoughts as well too. I want to thank the rest of the postdoc committee and our attendees. We had a really good turnout. There were about 65 people on through the duration. So good luck to everybody. And please, please reach out to me, other members of the postdoc committee, if you have questions, you're encountering problems, you think there's something that we can do with that, we're willing to kind of put our efforts in those areas. And there's many links, the document that with the slides that I put at the end, there's many links to resources. And so I encourage people to take a look at that. So good luck to everybody and stay safe and healthy as much as possible.
Thanks a lot, Wayne.
Thank you, everyone.